My name is Nate Klemp, and I'm a co-founder of Life Cross Training, which is the program that underlies the book, and also co-author of Start Here, the book. And my background is very much in academia and philosophy. I majored in philosophy and decided I wanted to live the good life and understand, the answers to life's big questions. So that took me to get a PhD in philosophy at Princeton. And somewhere around that time, at the end of my PhD, I realized that after 10 years of pretty intense philosophical training, my life was actually worse in a lot of ways. And so that set me on a very different path. I started to meditate. I started doing yoga. I started reading a lot of the philosophers who talk about philosophy as an art of living and not just a set of ideas. And was a philosophy professor for about 4 years, but then met Eric about 4.5 years ago. And that's when we founded Life Cross Training and started writing the book.
Very cool. And one thing, it's pretty. I like it. What you mean is that life only got worse, because I often say I move myself around in the spiritual circles, and you give somebody, you have a car, a beautiful car, and then you give somebody the user manual and say, hey, now you're able to drive. And then they try, it's a standard, and they try to use the clutch, and it stalls, and again, and they don't get it, because now they have the feeling that they understand life, so to speak, from a spiritual level, but now it gets even worse because they're supposed to get it, but they don't get it. And
Right.
and I think that's also where your book comes in.
Exactly.
But Eric, I'm curious to listen to you.
Eric Langshur and I'm Nate's co-author and co-founder of Life Cross Training. And I actually found Nate because he did the coolest thing on the planet. He took a year off, he took a sabbatical to actually live the practices of these great philosophers and great thinkers of the ages. So rather than just have it be this academic construct, he said, I'm going to put it into motion, and I'm going to put it all into motion in my own life. So that was, I came across Nate with his experience online that he was sharing with the world. And I said, I need to meet this guy because that is absolutely fantastic. That was, 5-ish years ago. And since then, we've become just amazing, not just business partners, but just tremendous friends. My background is as a corporate exec with large corporations, United Technologies and Bombardier. And then I became an entrepreneur in healthcare tech space in 2000 and founded my first company, and have been doing that ever since. And in the last 5 years, I've been an investor, venture capitalist. My firm is Abundant Venture Partners, headquartered here in Chicago.
Very, very cool. Thank you for the introduction. I can relate a lot to your life story. I used to be a CEO with American Express, responsible for 3 countries in Europe, and I took a little longer break from the corporate world, about 15 years. So I moved from the Netherlands to Canada with my family, and I basically started only a few years ago. I started to get into some more of the combination of the business side and the more spiritual and philosophical. And a lot of the people that I interview inspire me so much. So for me, it's very enriching. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I'm a fan of all things Dutch. I've spent so much time in the Netherlands back in my aerospace days. We had a lot of business enterprises in and across the country, including Maastricht, where I spent a lot of time. And I'm Canadian, grew up in Montreal.
Okay. Yeah.
Vancouver.
Yeah. I live very close to the Space Center in Noordwijk in the Netherlands.
Oh, great.
Yeah. That's the ESTA, European Space Agency. Yeah. Okay, well, cool. Well, I got this book, and I really love the book, The Master of Lifelong Habit of Wellbeing, Start Here. Groundbreaking science-based program for emotional fitness. And the first thing, and of course I like to be a little critical, but I know that you guys appreciate that. There is so much information out there, in the world about stress, and we seem to be suffering as a nation. So why another book about stress? And I don't point the question to one of you. You either feel called to respond.
Yeah, I can feel that one. That is actually one of the impetuses for us writing the book, because our experience, both of us had this independent journey to through this philosophical wisdom and really through the science. But what we realized is there's so much out there, and so much of it is fantastic. But what does one believe? Like where does one turn? Where can one find a comprehensive program that's going to help people find the most efficient path for the art of living? And our core insight here was we can take all of this amazing wisdom and all of the incredible science and distill it into one validated, deeply researched program that takes people from the very beginning of the journey to the end, regardless of where you're starting, and wraps measurement around it so people can actually track their own progress. So the big idea here, of course, is that well-being is a skill that can be trained. But for us, it was about how can we help people know everything they need to know and find the most efficient path to improve their own happiness.
Yeah. Well, and I love what I said before. I love the science that you guys bring into it. And what I didn't mention is that I am also a trainer with the Institute of Heart Math. And you guys are probably familiar with that. So I love the science that you bring into it, because that people also find measurements for themselves, because I think that's really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you mentioned, of course, a lot about, you talk about the emotional fitness. What does that mean? Give me some more information about what is emotional fitness.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can take that one. So the way we describe it is everybody knows what physical fitness is. And, there's all these programs out there for getting more fit. And we were actually really inspired when we wrote this by programs like P90X and CrossFit, where they're based on this idea that, you can incorporate a number of different exercises and that by cross-training, you actually become stronger and your training progresses more quickly than if you were to just do one thing. So what we now know, thanks to the last 20 or 30 years of neuroscience, is that the brain and the mind can be trained in the very same way that the body can be trained. And that's really the core insight behind this idea of mental or emotional fitness. It's this idea that we now know through doing the right practices, you can increase your ability to deal with stress, increase your level of resiliency. And the way you do that is through practice and through habit change. So that's really what we decided to do, is create a program that was based on this idea of giving people the tools they needed to change their habits. Because I know in my case, when I started reading books on happiness and well-being and going to retreats and things like that, I go to an amazing retreat and it would be like, oh, wow, it blew my mind. And then 2 weeks later, I would go right back to the very same habits and wonder, what happened? Like, where did that insight go? What I finally started to realize for myself is that the real key was habit change. And to do that, I had to be consistent. And it wasn't just about going to a bunch of cool retreats. It was about the daily practice of rewiring the brain and changing those habits.
I'm so glad that you say that, because one of my questions was, what I know from my own experience working with people, and of course knowing myself, at the hardest part, of change is taking the time to do it. And maybe you can take me through one of your exercises, or how does that typical work? When people buy the book and they want to get into this and want to adopt the program. So why is it so unique, and why do you feel that the change that you guys propose is also working in the way you have set it up?
Right. Well, it's more than just we feel it. We actually know it to be true. And that's one of the things that you experienced, Dirk, and you were mentioning this, the science-based approach that we took to it. So we wanted to get beyond the, here's a neat idea, we think it's really cool, and we're going to turn it into a book. We really wanted to get to those core practices that actually had hard science supporting them, so that we could say, without a doubt, that if this, then that. And so the way that we approach the whole subject is through the lens of the big idea that well-being is a skill that can be trained. And I'll say it again, right? Because it's so important. It's linked to this idea of fitness, emotional fitness. Well-being is a skill that can be trained. And that we know to train it, we need to train the skill of attention. So where we direct and choose our thoughts. And then what we were able to do by distilling really the most efficient and effective practices for training the skill of attention that lead to well-being, we came up with a program that all of these, there's 9 practices in the Life Cross-Training system that we lay out in the book Start Here. All of these practices can be integrated into the living of our lives, so that unlike physical fitness, we don't have to stop every day and go off to the gym for an hour or get onto the cushion for an hour and meditate. That this is really an integrative set of tools that we can carry around with us and unpack, in any moment, whether we're at, in line at Starbucks, whether we're sitting at a red light and waiting, and especially we can integrate into the stressful moments in our lives, so that we can remember to notice, shift, rewire into well-being.
Can I jump in and just add a little bit of color to that?
Yeah.
So, there's this idea that your listeners will be very familiar with of being in the present moment, and you read a book like Tolle's, The Power of Now, and the whole idea is, be present. And it's a great idea. And for the longest time, when I heard that idea, I tried my best to be present. But what would happen is I would be really present and attentive to the sounds, sights, and sensations of this moment for about 5 minutes. And then for the rest of the day, I'd go off on, whatever mind-wandering trip happened to be, up for me that day. And what we realized is that we needed to create a more systematic way of training that habit. So I give that as an example because that is one of the life cross-training practices. And what we tell people in the book is a really easy way to create this habit is to have a cue. And the cue that we recommend as kind of the trigger for initiating the habit is taking a shower, something everybody does every day, hopefully. And also a place where it's very difficult to distract yourself, right? It's really hard to take your phone in there unless you have some crazy waterproof phone. And so if you use the shower as your cue, then all of a sudden every day for at least that time while you're in the shower, you have this intentional routine or habit of being present. And the more that becomes a habit every day, what we've experienced is that presence kind of emerges more organically, more frequently. So that's just one example. And for all of the habits, we have a similar construct where there's a cue that reminds people to do it. And then it's something that once it becomes a habit once a day, it's more easy to do it throughout the rest of the day.
Yeah, and does it, like, to create a habit, is that the typical 21 days that people are talking about to repeat something, or do you see that in a different daylight?
Yeah, it certainly can be. It doesn't have to be. We rely heavily on research from folks like BJ Fogg that's talk about start small, tiny habits, and then we unpack a system around that. All in a way we've wrapped really helpful tips into everything that we present, as you've seen, right, with the book, to make it approachable, to make it accessible, to make it understandable, and most importantly, to help people build these habits into their own lives.
Yeah, that's cool. So I would like to learn a little bit more about, you talk about the ancient wisdom and the modern neuroscience, that is so closely interwoven with each other. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure, I can take that one. To me, this was the most fascinating part of researching this book and writing the book was the finding that basically every practice we found that ran throughout a number of these ancient traditions was also beginning to receive all sorts of scientific validation. So, one great example is meditation, right? Everybody knows meditation has been around for years and years. It emerges in almost every spiritual tradition in different forms. Even in the Western philosophical tradition, actually, there's evidence that the ancient Greeks in various schools of thought practiced a form of meditation. So this is a practice that runs throughout many different philosophical and spiritual traditions. And it's always had a kind of spiritual argument for its benefits. But what we now know is, while that still could be the case and is the case for many people, even if you have no spiritual leanings or, no sort of, religious ambitions in your practice, there are all sorts of benefits related to well-being. So Richard Davidson, who wrote the foreword to the book, he's probably the preeminent neuroscientist who studied this over the last 20 years. And in his studies, what he's found is not only do beginning meditators report a change in their level of mental well-being, they report decreased anxiety and just increased well-being. But when they do fMRI scans of their brain before and after, what they find is that the brain of meditators changes in just about 8 weeks. So people who have never meditated before, they do a scan before, scan after, and after 8 weeks, there's a significant shift in what they call right to left prefrontal activation. So a kind of shift from brain activity from the right side to the left side, which is one of the most important indicators of well-being. So to me, I think that's what's really interesting is that we can now see, objective evidence that this is actually changing the structure of the brain, in addition to all the great benefits that the ancients mentioned.
Yeah, that's thanks for explaining that, because I think it's important, because a lot of people often don't get that. They say, well, we have the ancient wisdom, but the modern neuroscience is so much more advanced. But of course, in our eyes, that might be that way, but they weren't stupid, like a couple of thousands of years ago, of course. So, yeah. So,
yeah, and we see them as both really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So in your book, you write or you talk about the notice-shift-rewire. I would love you to just briefly explain this principle to me.
Sure. We call it the master practice in life cross training. And the key idea here is that in order to train the skill of well-being, we need to train the skill of attention. And in order to just, to attend, to decide what we're going to attend to, we have to remember to notice. And so noticing is all important, because when we notice that we're lost in thought. We notice that we're in an anxiety loop. We notice that we're stressed. We notice that we're not present. We notice that we're not behaving compassionately. All of these wonderful cues and triggers to notice. We bring our attention back. And then notice sets up part two, which is the shift. So once you've noticed, then you stand a chance of shifting. And there's all sorts of wonderful techniques to shift. And we'll go with the practice of gratitude, which is very well understood and well known. So the life cross training gratitude practice and tip that we share is gratitude around meals. So the idea when we sit down to eat, just to notice. This is a moment to shift to gratitude, and there's so much to be grateful for in those moments. And we can do it, in a way that we verbalize our gratitude for the people that we're with, or it can just be a silent little measure where we take in the good, the bounty of the food, or the dear relationships of the people that we're with, or the fact that we even have food, and there's so much to be grateful for. So shift to gratitude. And then the third part, which is so important, is this idea of literally rewiring our brains. So the concept is, of course, that the brain is neuroplastic. And that's one of the key ideas that enables all of this, that's informed all of the research, that our brain is malleable, and that we can, as Donald Hebb said in the 1940s, neurons that fire together, wire together, we can lay down new neural pathways by just attending to them. So when we feel the gratitude, just to savor it for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, really take in the good, as Rick Hansen says, and sit in it. And that's the process of rewiring and repeated notice-shift-rewire cycles over and over and over. They start to build moments that blend together in our lives, and really it starts to physically change our brains, and in the process we change the experience of what it is to be alive, and how we feel, how we show up in the world, how much time we spend mind wandering and in anxiety loops, and all of that just frees up like incredible energy to be productive, to be present, to show up in the world in a whole different way. Simple notice, shift, rewire.
Well, it's very clear, and I'm very happy with your explanation, because you also answered my last. Oops, is the my recording. The last question, and that is, of course, we've been talking quite a bit of science, and you bring in the gratitude, etc. So people might have thought, well, maybe this is nothing for me. It's too scientific. But when you read the book, it's not. It's really cool science that you use to support the change. And you already answered actually my last question, where I would ask, what is really happening? What do you feel? What do you notice when you become more emotional fit? But you say, you free up so incredible, amount of energy, and you become so much more present. Is there any physical changes that you will notice in your body?
Yeah, I can take that one. So when I started this whole journey, it was about 8 years ago. It was the end of graduate school. And I was about the least emotionally fit person on the planet. Stress was almost crippling to me at that point. And just making it through the day was very difficult. I struggled with a lot of anxiety and depression and that sort of thing. So it was a very intense moment for me. And what I noticed as I started incorporating these practices into my life, as I started meditating and incorporating some of these other practices, is that it was a very slow and subtle, but a kind of steady shift in the way I was able to relate to stress and to challenge and just the things that happen in life. So it wasn't that things got easier, there were still all sorts of challenges and all sorts of stressful moments that were coming my way. But it was as though I had an ability to just be in those moments and an ability to be present with whatever was happening, and almost more relaxed in the midst of those moments. I think about it almost like there's a threshold level that we have for how much we can take before we get totally overwhelmed. I was here, and the more I did these practices, the more that threshold started to rise. And So that was my experience, and it may sound subtle, but for me, it completely changed my life in every way. My relationships were stronger. I was more successful in my work. I had more energy. My posture changed. You asked about physical changes. I started doing more yoga, and my posture was more upright. It was just a really amazing transformation for me.
Very, very cool. Well, I can't recommend this book enough to people to start here, because I really love the book myself, and especially readers and listeners who know me a little bit and follow me. They might want to pick it up and read it. Maybe as a last point, you also have something going on online related to what you've been writing in the book, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we have a free 4-week mindfulness e-course, which you can sign up for online. The website is starthere.life. So if you go to starthere.life, there's information about the book, but also you can sign up for this free course, which will talk much more in depth about notice, shift, rewire and how to integrate that into everyday life moments.
Super cool. Thanks so much, both Eric and Nate, for the explanation and talking with me, and also just bringing forth that book and the message of, having the awareness that you have the ability to create a more emotional fitness in your life, because a lot of people often are basically being at the mercy of whatever is being thrown at them. And, Nate, you already explained that in your previous life, so to speak. But I think it's really important that people feel more empowered after reading this book as well. So thank you so much for doing that.
Well, thank you, Dirk. And in the spirit of gratitude, we're grateful for you. This was really fun for us to do. And we're grateful for people who picked up the book. We were thrilled we made the New York Times bestseller list, and that this is having such an impact on so many people's lives. So it's really deeply, deeply rewarding for us. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dirk. Yeah, this is great.